My truth has been revealed. At the cost of everything I knew, my last safe haven falls behind me with the self that once consumed. Into the void, I'm pursuing only answers. I'm shedding skins and faces, past loves and bitter hatreds. And it has come to pass. A path set in stone now breaks like glass. The failings of yesterday become the catalyst to seek my change. I don't really know where else I could take that, but those are just the intro lyrics to the song Hollow by Parkway Drive. And I thought it'd be funny because, you get it, right? Like the pure vessel is hollow and like becomes the Hollow Knight. So there's, you know what? Never mind. Anyway, Pure Boy, you're up next. So, based on the overall amount of feedback from the previous episode of Radiant Mastery, I was actually pretty surprised that far more people asked for Pure Vessel over other bosses. And as such, I gotta give the people what they want. Sure, I guess you could say that I'm just using this notion deep down inside as an excuse to put off Markoth and Absolute Radiance, but, potatoes, all that jazz. Even still, this actually works out relatively well for us. With the previous episode being about Nightmare King Grimm, I think it should at least be mentioned that there are some striking similarities between these two bosses. The predecessors of both of them are essentially slower, less punishing versions that have their moves amped up or slightly altered in their stronger forms, with the addition of a few new moves, of course. They're both equally fair and painfully punishing for their mistakes, and there's little to no randomness. So if you watch the previous episode, just keep in mind that a lot of the same overarching themes and concepts from Nightmare King Grimm do actually carry over with Pure Vessel as well. That being said, I'll likely reference Grimm for a few aspects of this fight, just to make the methodology for fighting Pure Vessel comparable to something else. As such, you should expect fast moves with narrow punish windows, intense mix-ups from attacks that constantly keep you guessing, and movement speeds which can only be rivaled by Ben Schwartz's adaptation into a hedgehog for a movie that should have failed by all accounts. No more time for rambling this week, people. We got a vessel that was once raised and trained to prime form, but needs a quick reminder that their glory days have long since come and gone. Let's dissect this has-been's every move with this episode of Radiant Mastery. If you didn't bring your calculators this episode, don't worry. I won't make anyone do math this time around. Let's try and save that for a boss that's actually difficult. In all seriousness though, I don't think going into the numbers of each particular method of damage output really matters as much here, because Pure Vessel's movements and attacks offer far less room for you to get fancy with your punishes, as opposed to Nightmare King Grimm. There's only a few instances of breaks in between moves, and even fewer actual opportunities when fighting this boss that would let you get crazy with what you could do. So I'm just going to focus on making this as linear as possible. Following in the footsteps of last episode, this build I'm presenting almost definitely isn't the definitive Pure Vessel Annihilator build. There are indeed other routes and approaches you could take that may be just as good, if not better, than what I'm about to suggest. But after hours of relentlessly challenging this boss on my own, I've again decided to take a hybrid build approach to cover all bases when it comes to dealing damage and avoiding hits. For charms this time around, I would recommend Sprint Master, Mark of Pride, Unbreakable or Fragile Strength, Quick Slash, and Shaman Stone. So long as a 3-notch charm is last, you can put these in any order you'd like. And with this fight being similar to Nightmare King Grimm, I actually found it very helpful to carry over a lot of the same charms, but with a slight alteration in the build that I'll explain soon enough. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the moveset for Pure Vessel. Overall, there's only 7 attacks that are done regularly, which are mandatory to respond to. Lunge, Triple Slash, Parry, Soul Daggers, Nail Pillars, Focus Auras, and Void Tendrils. Remember, there are a few other moves that Pure Vessel does technically have to use against you, such as the direct jump at you, or the backstep if you get too close, but for the purposes of this video, just know that these supplemental movements are minor additions in between bigger moves that you can adapt and react to with the slightest amount of practice. As such, you probably won't run into any major difficulties outside of the 7 core attacks for this boss. For some more general info, do note that it'll take about 12 hits overall to force Pure Vessel into a stagger, and both this along with all the other moves each have their own punish windows and damage options. So let's get a closer look at how to handle each attack with this build. Let's ease into this by first examining one of the most basic and frequent attacks for this fight, the lunge. This attack is one of the fastest things the Pure Vessel has to use against you, and it can actually be used back to back or very quickly after the end of another attack, meaning that it can be a huge annoyance if you swing your nail one too many times for a punish beforehand, or find yourself in a situation that's hard to get quickly out of. On the other hand, this is balanced out by the fact that this move is actually one of the easiest attacks to dodge or punish consistently, with a bit of practice. So let's break it down piece by piece. First, since I already stated that this move can come out quickly after others, I'd also like to mention that just about every single attack from the Pure Vessel can come out immediately after it teleports as well. And yes, this thing here can actually teleport to either side of the arena during the fight, which really makes you start to wonder how much the Pale King shafted us when it comes to abilities, but whatever. With that being said, we now know that this move can be triggered after 3 separate scenarios: as a follow-up, after a teleport, and directly from neutral, which essentially means that you always need to be prepared for this move to happen at any moment, or your run can end in a matter of seconds due to the sheer speed of this attack. As far as the breakdown of the animation goes, the Pure Vessel will take any one of its given startup options for the attack, and then quickly begin the animation for the lunge. It assumes a little jousting stance for just a brief moment before dashing left or right in a perfectly straight line, depending upon where the knight is relative to the vessel. About half the distance of the entire arena will be covered from the lunge by the time it finishes. One quick thing to note about the entire fight starting here is that you can receive a huge amount of help by actually listening to audio cues from each move, rather than solely depending on visuals, since they're lightning fast on their own. Each one of Pure Vessel's attacks is preceded by audio warnings that are all slightly different, and since this boss is actually capable of teleporting off screen and then dashing forwards into you with this lunge, the audio cues can be invaluable to fill in the gaps for an upcoming attack if the visuals aren't enough help. That being said, this is the tiny piece of audio which signifies that a lunge is about to happen. Once the lunge is complete, the Pure Vessel will either choose to follow up with another attack or a teleport, so just try to never let your guard down during the full duration of this move. With all of the basics covered for this attack, let's finally move into the punishes. Juxtaposed to my Nightmare King Grimm video, I don't particularly think breaking this fight down into both safe and aggressive punishes is very helpful here. This is primarily because Nightmare King Grimm's fight offers consistent amounts of opportunities to get yourself accustomed to a nice pattern of damage output. It's relatively easy to know when to swing your nail versus when you should scream at him from the depths of the abyss because the fight is very methodical and slower paced as opposed to Pure Vessel. With this boss, I frequently found myself using punishes based on the situation I was in at the time. As such, I'll instead just cover the reactions to each move in all the ways I found beneficial and group them under one unified section of punishes, in addition to which ones I think are the most and least helpful. Then you can pick and choose which methods you wish to use. The knee-jerk reaction for this move is a Shade Cloak dash right through the Pure Vessel. The window for safety isn't too short, but it does require the slightest bit of awareness so you can properly make sure the invincibility frames from Shade Cloak don't disappear while you're directly underneath the vessel's grundle. I also wouldn't ever try to use a dash away from the vessel under almost any circumstances during this whole fight. All of the attacks have such vast horizontal distances that going towards the same direction that the vessel is attacking from almost never works. After a safe dash through the boss, you can either follow up with a Shade Soul or just a couple nail slashes if you can walk back to the boss fast enough. However, I strongly recommend against actively going for these options as punishes for this move. As you'll soon see, Shade Cloak has a much better use for a separate attack that we'll talk about next, so burning it here can put you in very bad spots if you get caught off guard by a following attack. I personally find it best to use this method as a last resort crutch to save you during oh shit scenarios as opposed to the primary method for damage output. Instead, I'd recommend pulling out Ol Reliable from the golden days of the Path of Pain and just pogo over this chump. There's most definitely a bit of a skill curve to perform a pogo over the lunge reliably, but you can find solace in the fact that the window for a pogo with Mark of Pride is huge. You can even hit the Pure Vessel's nail and have it still count as a pogo, so all that's really required is for you to find the right reaction time. After a pogo, you can follow up with 1 or 2 horizontal nail slashes for some additional quick damage, so long as you don't get greedy with the swings. This boss has some heavy punishes for trying to get too much damage after every move, so a pogo with only 1 horizontal nail swing can be just fine, but you can always adjust on the fly depending on the situation during the fight. It's also possible to simply double jump over the boss if you're really not into taking risks, but you'd lose out on a bit of damage, and this fight revolves around constantly whittling away at the vessel's health. So I'd suggest using this early on to get a feel for the reaction timing, and then just switching to pogoing once you feel confident enough in your abilities. Next up, we've got the triple slash. If you've mastered the last move, then this one should come to you pretty easily due to how similar they are fundamentally. You can tell that this attack is coming when you see the vessel take a quick stance with the nail held back behind its head. This startup animation actually lasts just a bit longer than the lunges animation, so you have a little more time to react. The trade-off for this is that there's really no audio cue here, so if you hear a whole lot of nothing off screen, you can be pretty sure that 3 nail slashes are coming your way. After a little under a second from the startup animation, the pure vessel does 3 quick, consecutive swipes in a horizontal line, based on where the knight is at when this move starts, and each swing carries it forward a bit. The entire move takes up about a third of the arena from start to finish, and flows quickly into other attacks shortly after it ends. As such, this means that our methods of damage have to come out very quickly during the attack, because rushing towards the pure vessel after the move has ended will barely grant us any damage, if at all. Overall, there's 2 reliable methods you have to deal with this move effectively. Arguably the easier option is our tried and true pogo technique. With a slightly longer startup and relatively identical hitbox size compared to the lunge, you can pretty easily get your jump high enough before the first swing to be in a safe pogo distance. In addition, it's actually possible to pogo multiple times off this attack with quick slash thanks to the parry mechanic, meaning that you can actually get some pretty decent damage here, with a bit of meticulous practice. But this isn't really necessary. 1 singular pogo off the vessel will be just fine to get you to safety, if you're not a big fan of being airborne. But my more preferred method to punish this attack, and something I'd advise using over a pogo because you can get it off pretty reliably so long as you don't burn Shade Cloak on a lunge, is the Shade Soul approach. It's necessary to hold on to Shade Cloak for a few moves during this fight, and I believe this is one of the most important ones. Once you realize this attack is starting, make it a priority to walk close enough to the vessel so you can get out a safe Shade Cloak dash through the boss, before or during the first swing. After you're safely on the opposite side of the vessel, flick yourself around and use Shade Soul as soon as possible. If you're fast enough with these movements, you can get a singular cast of Shade Soul to tick twice during the duration of the move, on top of the fact that you can almost always get out 2 casts, if you have the soul to do so. Though the second cast likely won't tick twice because the boss will have stopped moving by this point. I'd advise against going for more than 2, as it's fairly easy to get hit by another attack in the small window from the second to the third cast. Although I prefer this method, I do realize that there's a few circumstances in which you have to use Shade Cloak to survive previous attacks that you just barely reacted to. Ideally, I'd say use this method to counteract triple slash as often as possible, but resort back to pogoing if need be. Both are efficient, but the key is to constantly watch your Shade Cloak cooldown. This boss forces you to move around and dodge numerous times throughout the fight, so as long as you're keeping a watchful eye on the paces and status of your dashes, you should be completely fine when it comes to adapting to all other moves on the fly, just as you would here. Since we just covered the main nail attacks the pure vessel can throw out, this would be a good time to cover the parry attack for our next analysis. This move can be weaved into essentially anything the pure vessel does, whether it be coming out of a stagger or directly after a previous attack. It's quick and a little bit annoying to deal with, but is super straightforward and relatively easy to counter. There's only 2 major parts to this entire move. First, the startup warning. The vessel raises its nail diagonally and goes on the defensive for about a second. The audio cue for this attack is this. If you don't fall for this trick, the boss lowers this defensive stance and continues on with its moveset. The other part unfortunately occurs if you activate its trap card here, in which case the vessel will parry your attack, as the move's name suggests, and try to send you to the Shadow Realm with a quick forward strike due to your pot of greed with nail swings. If you're quick enough, you can actually Shade Cloak dash through this attack, but this should only be done if you absolutely have to. There's nothing to gain from triggering this attack overall, so if you just pace your swings and consciously watch for this attack, there probably won't be much of a problem here. With just about all of the close range options out of the way, let's move to the most common ranged attack during this fight, the Soul Daggers. Following in the trend of attacks that can come from seemingly nowhere with little warning behind them, this attack can get pretty hectic and be a huge nuisance if you can't quite seem to find out how to handle it. But on paper, there's really not a lot to this move either. An important thing to note about the startup from this attack is that, at least from all of my personal experience fighting this boss, this move almost always happens after a teleport rather than just being an immediate follow-up from a prior neutral attack, which both the lunge and the triple slash are capable of doing. Please feel free to fact check me on this, but from all the footage I recorded and attempts I made to fight this boss, I couldn't get this move to trigger without a teleport beforehand. This is likely due to the fact that this move requires spacing from the vessel to make full use of this attack anyway, but it's just something I think is useful to know. As such, the audio cue here will be instrumental in helping determine if this attack is coming, and the sound for this attack's startup is as follows. From start to finish for this move, the vessel stands completely still. A little after the audio cue, 7 soul daggers will be shot out in an upwards arc. All of the daggers are spread out equally, with the first one always firing lower into the ground, and the last dagger always being shot directly above the boss. After the final dagger has fully disappeared, the pure vessel will move on to another attack. Bear in mind that there's also a bit of a visual cue to help determine where the daggers are being shot, as there are some thin beacons of light which map out the direct path each dagger will take as it travels. The daggers themselves aren't too huge either, so the majority of suffering from this attack just comes from figuring out where to move. Admittedly, the solution I found probably isn't the overall best way to respond to this move, but it's gotten me through the fight multiple times with just a bit of practice. So here's what I've got. We know the daggers are going to come in a particular pattern no matter what, with the first 2 basically shooting into the ground if you're somewhat far away from the vessel. We can also determine that the third dagger essentially comes out in a horizontally straight line, and we can essentially ignore all other daggers to make things easier. The first method occurs if you're a bit closer to the vessel. Start walking towards the boss while waiting for the daggers to start spawning, and when you see them finally start to shoot out, simply dash forward while staying on the ground. After the dash, you'll be roughly in range to get 2 cheeky nail slashes once you know you're safe to help build up soul. Again, I'd advise against any more than this just in case a parry or dash comes out while you're flailing away at its kneecaps, but do what feels right for you. The other way to deal with this move is when you're farther away, but doesn't change up a whole lot fundamentally. You'll notice that the arc slightly changes when at a distance. The first 2 daggers come out just a bit higher, which changes how we're going to respond to this. Don't move forward this time, just patiently wait for the daggers to spawn. Once they're shot out, take a neutral jump off the ground, or arc it ever so slightly towards the direction the boss is in, and time a Shade Cloak dash right as soon as you see the second dagger coming towards you. Depending on the height of your jump and your distance, you should either be safely between the second and third dagger, or just end up dashing through one of the daggers altogether. Once again, after these movements, you should be roughly close enough to hit the vessel, or only need to walk forward a few steps to still get off 2 nail swings. But that's about all you have to do. You can honestly choose to just get familiar with the general pattern here, and then come up with your own dash or jump until you find something that works for you, but this has grown to be an effective way of maneuvering around this attack on my end, after a bit of practice. As a final point, attacks that follow up from this move seem to come out super fast, although that could just be somewhat of a personal bias. Try your best to be vigilant after the punish here towards whatever's coming next, and you'll have this attack down to a science. For this next move, you're in a really good spot if you've gotten Nightmare King Grimm all figured out by this point, because we're about to discuss the nail pillars. Broadly speaking, this move is essentially a better version of Cloak Spikes because we actually have the opportunity to deal some damage during or at the end of the phase. But other than that, this move is as straightforward as it can possibly be. Pure Vessel uses this attack by either jumping up in the air first, or by teleporting into the air after another move, but the motions from here on out are identical regardless of which startup animation is used. There's not really an audio cue that can help you identify when this move is being used beforehand, but it's one of the easiest to spot visually, as it's the only one which involves the boss being airborne before starting. After just a brief moment of being in the air, the vessel plunges downwards directly. The AoE for this plunge isn't terribly large, and there are actually certain situations where it will plunge downwards right onto you and still miss, even if you don't dash away. Sprint Master can be really helpful here for this reason, and actually helps set you up for the second part of this move as well. Once the boss makes contact with the ground, you'll begin to see pillars of light that resemble the beams we see in the Soul Daggers attack. Much like Nightmare King Grimm's cloak spikes, these act as a preliminary warning to where an actual attack will eventually erupt, and they're also equally spread out horizontally throughout the arena. These pillars stay for just under a second before nails rise up from the ground, leaving only small safe spaces for you to stand in, then disappear after about half a second. As with the cloak spikes, I can't really offer any sage advice or definitive solution to this part, as it really just depends on how familiar you are with the distancing of the pillars. I will say, however, that you're far better off just making tiny corrections in positioning when not in a safe zone. There's a decent amount of time for you to react and make this part painless with just a bit of familiarity and learning to keep your movements under control. And try to stay as close to the boss as possible. This'll come in handy for the punish. The vessel will then be vulnerable for just a brief moment before moving on to another attack. Now, I know I said that this move is technically more favorable for us than cloak spikes due to the fact that we can deal damage here, but this is where I play devil's advocate and turn your whole world upside down. Going for damage here is actually super risky, unless it's done at the very end of the attack. While the AoE for the initial dive is pretty small, the hitboxes for the nails feel monumental. You can literally put yourself out of a safe spot and into a nail pillar by simply swinging your nail horizontally, or casting Shade Soul while the pillars are out, because both of these cause the slightest bit of knockback. I've tried to circumvent this on numerous occasions to make it possible to get damage here, but I learned to just accept the bitter reality that you'd be better off going for a nail swing or two after the pillars disappear and leaving the punish at that. If you have any insider knowledge on this that I'm ignorant of, or have a workaround for this altogether, please do share it in the comments for everyone. But as far as I'm concerned, I've learned my lesson the hard way. This move is as dead to me as it can be. Save yourself the hassle and succeed where I failed. Just play the safe game and you'll be A-okay. With this attack covered, we've officially discussed all of the moves that the pure vessel can use from the very start of the fight. Now, let's have a look at the attacks that don't trigger until certain phases. First up are the focus auras. This move only starts to show up after the pure vessel gets lowered to 1056 HP, and with the vessel's overall health pool being about 1600, you can consider yourself roughly a third of the way through the whole fight when you see this attack introduced into the moveset. This attack is a bit trickier due to various little aspects during each of its phases, so I'll try to make this as straightforward as I can. From what I've tested, this move almost never happens after a teleport, but as always, please feel free to correct this if you've seen otherwise. Even still, I've only caught this move after a direct follow-up from a previous attack or after the vessel backdodges. So the reality is that the damage you deal for the punish phase here will likely overlap with the punish you're carrying out from the prior phase you just went through. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's have a look at the animations first. You'll know this move has begun when you see the boss hunch down a bit and assume a position that looks like what the knight does when focusing soul. The audio cue is also very similar to the sound of us focusing soul as well. After a brief moment into this startup animation, a large circle around the vessel will outline itself, and a full-on aura will explode inside the circle just fractions of a second later as the boss moves out of its hunched look and tilts its head back. After the aura dissipates and the vessel goes back to its regular stance, 6 smaller auras will appear randomly all around the arena. These can be right on the ground or all the way up in the air, which is arguably the hardest part of this phase to avoid due to the relative randomness of the circumstance. These smaller auras will sequentially implode in the order that they showed up in, and to make things even more chaotic, the vessel can even start another attack before the last aura has fully imploded, making it possible for this attack to somewhat overlap with others, and become very difficult to visually determine which attacks are coming next as the auras explode. The silver lining is that we can actually mitigate this just a bit through punishes, so let's now discuss how to respond to this move. As I mentioned earlier, the punish you're carrying out from a previous attack can essentially turn into half of the punish for this attack in and of itself. For example, if the vessel does a lunge and then follows up with this move, your 1 to 2 nail slashes from a regular lunge punish can turn into 3 to 4 swings back to back as the large aura starts to spawn in. Try to be flexible when it comes to these swings, as sometimes being farther away while this move starts obviously won't net you a ton of hits, but being adaptable on the fly is crucial for this move in particular. As a general rule of thumb though, I'd say roughly 2 nail swings if you have to walk to the vessel from farther away, and about 4 total nail swings if the punish for the previous attack overlaps with this move. After the final swing, immediately dash away from the vessel into a safe spot. If you can get the timing right here, you'll get out your nail swings and dash literally just before the large aura explodes. After you're clear of the large AoE, immediately flick yourself around and try to fire 2 Shade Souls at the boss. You'll almost always have enough juice for at least 1, but 2 is the ideal here. The reason I mention this is because we can get the vessel to stagger a lot immediately after this move. We already mentioned earlier that it takes about 12 hits for the boss to be staggered in general. And if we get the max punish of 4 swings and 2 Shade Souls, then we've just covered half the hits we need to get the boss to stagger in only 1 rotation of attacks. In addition, the number of hits needed to stagger reduces to only 9 if each hit is done sequentially, or basically with a little less than a second apart from each hit. As such, this move is the best for us to hit the boss as many times as we can because the stagger here is incredibly helpful. Since we know that another attack can begin before this one fully ends, getting a stagger as all the auras explode is a huge window of safety for us that stops the vessel dead in its tracks, giving us an ample amount of time to reposition and safely avoid the smaller auras before the boss gets back up. This obviously won't get us a stagger every time after this move is done, but you'll be very close to a stagger after this punish either way. If you don't get a stagger here, just focus on looking for a safe spot as soon as you're done firing spells and watch the boss diligently for the next attack. You can expect to get a stagger very soon in the next few hits. Before moving on to the last move, let's talk about the general reaction to a stagger. I know we just covered how to react to a stagger during the focus auras, but you're guaranteed to get a few staggers before that attack is even introduced into the moveset. That being said, I wanted to briefly highlight a couple important notes about how to handle staggers. Make sure to always be on the lookout for these, as it's easy to carry out a rampage of nail swings and accidentally pull the boss right back into its moveset. Also, be aware of the fact that hitting the vessel with multiple Shade Souls can actually mess you up a bit in very rare circumstances, especially if a double tick or 2 consecutive casts take it out of a stagger immediately. Otherwise, if you get a stagger from a pogo or triple slash punish, I'd really advise taking a moment to recuperate and make sure your Shade Cloak is ready to use again if you just burned it on the previous attack. To punish a stagger, I'd suggest a nail slash followed up by an immediate Shade Soul for some large, quick damage. This can be particularly useful if the vessel chooses to back dodge after recovering from the stagger, because Shade Soul will tick twice, but this is ultimately out of our control. If you don't have the soul, just go for 2 nail swings instead. You also could technically charge up a nail art here if you want, but I personally think that the whole process without Nailmaster's Glory is a bit too long for how fast-paced this fight is. On top of the fact that Great Slash and Slash Dash actually do less damage and give you less soul than 2 nail swipes with Unbreakable or Fragile Strength, leaving Cyclone Slash as your only advantageous option, but also your most risky choice as well. Maximizing on punishes in a safe way is the ideal standard, but you can ultimately decide how to dish out damage here based on preference. Finally, we've reached the last attack in the Pure Vessel's kit, the Void Tendrils. This move is introduced into the Vessel's moveset once it hits 528 health, which essentially means you're roughly 2/3 of the way through the fight by the time you see this move. And although it's the last technical addition to the attack options this boss has, it's actually not too difficult to evade and punish. The telegraphed animation for this move starts with the Vessel standing upright and revealing his hidden stash of tentacle hentai for about 3/4 of a second. After this period, 2 extra long tendrils of void will lash out across roughly 60% of the arena for a little under a second, then vanish right back into the vessel as the move ends. Not the most mechanically intimidating move during this fight to be sure, but it can certainly be annoying at first if it surprises you out of nowhere. And as always, here's the audio cue which precedes this attack. The punish for this move isn't all that complex either. Once you know the move is starting, get ready to jump, but don't feel compelled to do it right away. You have a decent amount of time to get airborne after the startup animation, and we're going to want as much time during our jump as we can get, so just pause for the briefest of moments before leaping upwards. Your relative distance to the vessel depends on whether or not you should dash towards it, but the punish nevertheless involves a pogo over the vessel, with 1 or 2 horizontal slashes on the other side of the tendrils after the move ends. I wouldn't recommend pogoing multiple times, however, simply because the jumping tendencies of the boss can ruin the whole run occasionally by using this method. Conversely, you could pogo and then follow up with Descending Dark, or you could even just use Descending Dark on its own if you don't want to risk the pogo. Just make sure you're close to the boss so you can get both ticks of damage. Any of these are good choices so long as you accommodate for your situation, as with every other move for this boss. And there you go. Every single offensive move the Pure Vessel can use, and some input on how to systematically handle this fight into broken down parts. Even though I was surprised this episode was as heavily requested as it was, I thoroughly understand where the difficulties and problems for this fight can arise with such an in-your-face kind of boss. Even still, I hope you learned a thing or two from this guide that showed you something interesting or new about this fight, even if you've already added this boss to your Radiant Hall of Gods hit list. Either way, I think it's fair to say we knocked this has-been down a few pegs, and proven that even in its prime, the purest of vessels will always possess some fatal flaws. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Radiant Mastery. I've left timestamps in the description for just about everything we covered in this episode, just in case you wish to go back and look for a specific part. Make sure to drop a comment if you have any additional insight over this fight that you may have found helpful, and let me know which boss you'd like to see a Radiant guide on next. Also, if you haven't already, feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's a great way to stay connected and keep up to date with whatever I may be working on outside of YouTube. That's all from me for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.